So what's happening more frequently these days is that people who were raised Christian, particularly young people, but not just young people, enter into a season of doubt, and they head online and they seek privately some answers for their doubt, and they end up on one of the massive YouTube channels that are published by Christians, former Christians rather, people raised as a Christian, who now are atheists, and they share about their doubts and their story of how they end up becoming atheists. They interview biblical scholars, many of whom often were raised Christians and are now atheists. And this is just sort of watering their doubt, the seeds of doubt, and it's sort of like Jack's beanstalk. The doubts just grow and grow. Now, this particular video was an interview with Dr. Bart Ehrman, who is one such former Christian, raised a Christian, now an atheist. And it's about 4 misconceptions that Christians have of the New Testament. And this video I'm doing here is just a selection of one of those misconceptions. Now, the doubt that arises for a Christian in watching something like this is coming from 2 directions. First, there's information outside of the Bible, whether it's the church fathers or Roman history or what have you, that Christians just simply aren't aware of. They're just not educated on all the context of what happened after the Bible, after the apostles, and so on. And so there's a ton of new information they often just have never heard and have no ability to refute, and they simply have to trust the expert. Sometimes that information is accurate, sometimes it's exaggerated, sometimes it's just a falsehood, or sometimes it's a difference of interpretation, what have you. But again, the Christian who's doubting can't really discern this, and so they're just trusting the expert. The second problem is that the expert, a biblical scholar, will refer to information actually within the Bible, internal to the Bible. And it may be, again, this information is perfectly accurate, and that person raised as a Christian simply has never noticed this, or they haven't heard it taught to them in Sunday school or what have you. So it's new information in that they just haven't noticed it. So, but then again, it can also be an exaggeration or a wrong interpretation or simply a difference of opinion. So all of this stuff gets thrown into the bucket and is watering this doubt. Now, there's 2 basic views on the Bible. There's what you'd call the traditional view that Christians have, traditional conservative evangelical type scholarship. It doesn't have to be evangelical, but traditional biblical scholarship, things that Christians have believed for thousands of years, like John the Apostle wrote the Gospel of John and so on. And then there's the critical scholarship, which is sort of the last 200 years or so worth of sort of extra skeptical kind of scholarship toward these traditional views. Now, some of the traditional views are traditional only in our own heads, and actually haven't even been the traditional view across Christianity. But sometimes the traditional views aren't quite right. And I don't mean, we're not talking about doctrines here. We're just talking about sort of the ways in which we view the Bible. And then some of the critical views are definitely not right. So trying to sort through this can be very challenging. So you only have 2 options. One is you can just educate yourself more, both on the Bible, which is definitely a route you should follow, internally, just reading the Bible and taking it more seriously, what it actually says. And then the second thing, which is also really healthy to do, particularly if you're younger and have a long life in front of you, and you want to have confidence in your faith and be able to communicate these things to other people, is you have to sort of arm yourself with some of the information outside of the Bible and learn there too. Now, for the time being, you can at least send some people over to iPUB and to videos like this and get sort of a response where I do have some expert knowledge and can speak to some of these things. So again, this is just a video on one of the 4 misconceptions, and the original audience I did the whole video for, I assumed was basically a skeptical audience. So you have to keep in mind, I'm talking about this particular misconception with the assumption that is more or less a skeptical audience that's listening to the video. Anyway, I hope this proves helpful to you.
The Proto-Orthodox Church Fathers did not accept the authority of any texts we now consider non-canonical. such as the Apocalypse of Peter?
This is a really good question, and it's very difficult to answer for some books. We do know that there are proto-Orthodox fathers who know and use books that did not make it into the canon. And you mentioned the Apocalypse of Peter, and it's a good example. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the Apocalypse of Peter it's not widely used. It's not used as much as, the Gospel of Mark or something, the Gospel of Matthew. Actually, it is probably used about as much as the Gospel of Mark, now that I say that. The Gospel of Mark wasn't used much either. But the Gospel of Peter wasn't used as widely as the Gospel of John, for example. But when it is used in the 2nd and 3rd century, it's used as scripture. And there are proto-Orthodox church fathers who actually call it scripture. Clement of Alexandria treats it as scripture. Methodius treats it as scripture. And there are other books as well, not just the Apocalypse of Peter, but there's a range of things. One of the first academic articles I wrote, I was a graduate student. I was studying with Bruce Metzger at Princeton Theological Seminary, and I wrote a term paper. He said, "You ought to publish this." So I did. It was an account of the canon found in Didymus the Blind, who was a 4th century church father. And I tried to show that he had a canon of scripture that was larger than the canon that Athanasius had, who was living at the same time. I analyzed his writings to show that he quoted other writings like the Shepherd of Hermas as scripture.
So I would need to be really careful commenting on Didymus, since Ehrman has done direct work on Didymus and has collected the data. But I've read a good bit of Didymus as well, and I mean it seems pretty obvious to me just from reading him that he's using the normal canonical writings we're familiar with the vast majority of the time, and then occasionally quotes some other writers. Now, he's right. I'm not denying at all, as you'll see later in some comments, I'm not denying at all that he uses other writers. But in terms of proportions, it's a very small. It's like the Didascalia. I did some work on that, and I mean you have just a few references, a couple of which are just plausible. They're not even certain, of some writings that are outside of sort of the Gospels and the New Testament sort of canonical works, and the overwhelming citations and references throughout the Didascalia, which was written around 200 AD, and it was overwhelmingly just the canonical writings that we're familiar with.
And so I think it's wrong to say that Proto-Orthodox did not accept anything except for the canonical 27. I think that's a complete anachronism.
So I think I'm pretty much in almost total agreement here with Ehrman. And the only thing I would say is just that the canonical writings that we know are by far the most represented writings. It's not really even close among the early sort of proto-Orthodox fathers. But definitely they had some other books that they read that they thought were valuable, that they read even in church. There was controversy about them for sure. Both Tertullian and the Muratorian fragment, which date to this is dating now to the final quarter of the 2nd century, so 175 to 200, somewhere in there. They clearly were already having councils among the churches debating and creating lists of books that were acceptable. And where they had suspicion in some of the churches about some of the books, those suspicions tended to grow, and those books tended to be used less and discounted later. So, and of course, Tatian, who compiled a kind of unigospel in the middle of the 2nd century, or middle to, say, 150 to 175, somewhere in there, he created essentially a gospel harmony, or something like a gospel harmony, called the Diatessaron, a continuous narrative of which incorporates all 4 Gospels, and he relies upon all 4 Gospels. He doesn't. There's maybe a couple references from outside of the 4 Gospels that make it into the Diatessaron, which suggest he had at least some other sources that he looked at. But I mean, we're talking 0.05% of the entire work. So it's overwhelmingly simply a compilation of stitching together the 4 Gospels as we know them.